hours just before dawn carry a particular stillness. They are neither night nor morning, but something in between, a pause in the day where the world feels suspended, waiting quietly for the first signs of movement to return. Streetlights remain on, homes are dark, roads are mostly empty. In these early hours, routine exists only for a few. Delivery drivers, shift workers, people whose days begin before most others have opened their eyes. For everyone else, the world rests. In the town of Midlothian, Texas, early mornings are usually uneventful. Midlothian sits south of Dallas, growing steadily, but still holding onto the rhythms of a smaller community. It is the kind of place where mornings normally begin with traffic building slowly, coffee shops opening their doors, and school drop-offs filling parking lots. But long before any of that begins, the town is quiet. On Monday, April 18th, 2016, the day started like any other. There were no storms, no unusual weather, no events scheduled that would draw attention. The sky was still dark when the first movements of the day began. At the Creekside Church of Christ, the building stood empty. The church was large, built to accommodate gatherings, services, and community events. During the day, it was filled with voices, footsteps, and movement. But before sunrise, it felt different. Hallways stretched long and silent. Rooms sat unused, lights off. The space echoed faintly when disturbed, the sound lingering longer than expected. The church was used for a variety of activities beyond worship. One of those activities was a fitness class. Every Monday morning, Missy Bevers taught an early workout session inside the church. It was part of a regular schedule that had become familiar to her and to the people who attended. Participants arrived early, ready to exercise before heading to work or starting the rest of their day. The routine mattered. It created consistency, structure, a sense of normalcy. Missy Bevers was at the center of that routine. She was 45 years old, a fitness instructor, a mother, and someone deeply involved in her community. She was known for her energy and her encouragement, for pushing people to work hard while still making the experience feel supportive. Fitness was not just her job. It was part of how she connected with others. She taught classes regularly, often early in the morning. She understood that those hours worked best for many people, even if they required discipline and commitment. Missy was accustomed to waking before dawn. She knew the quiet of those hours well. On that Monday morning, she was scheduled to teach her class at the church. As she had many times before, she planned to arrive early, set up equipment, and prepare the space before participants began to arrive. Nothing about that plan was unusual. Her class had been advertised. People were expecting her. As the morning progressed, movement began inside the church, though not in the way anyone would have expected. Just after 4 o'clock in the morning, security cameras inside the building recorded activity. The cameras were installed for routine security. They were not monitored constantly. Most of what they captured was uneventful. Empty hallways, lights switching on and off, occasional staff or volunteers moving through the building. On this morning, however, the footage showed something different. A person entered the church. They were dressed in clothing that immediately stood out. The figure wore what appeared to be police-style tactical gear. A helmet, a vest, protective pads. At a glance, the outfit resembled law enforcement equipment, though it was not standard issue. The person moved slowly through the building. There was no sign of urgency, no indication of rushing. They walked down hallways, opened doors, and wandered through rooms. Sometimes they paused. Sometimes they stopped entirely, as if considering their surroundings. The movements felt deliberate, but not hurried. The person carried tools. At different moments, they appeared to use them to strike doors or walls, not with force meant to break through, but enough to cause damage. It was unclear whether the damage was intentional or incidental. The behavior did not resemble a burglary in progress. Nothing was being taken. Nothing appeared to be searched for. The person moved deeper into the building, room by room, hallway by hallway. The footage was silent. No voices, no alarms, only the visual record of movement in an otherwise empty space. The figure's face was fully obscured. The helmet and gear concealed defining features. There was no clear indication of age, no obvious sign of gender. The person's height and build were difficult to determine from the footage alone. As minutes passed, the person continued moving through the church. At times, their walk appeared unusual. Some observers later described it as heavy. Others noticed a slight sway. The gait would become a point of intense focus in the years that followed. But at that moment, no one was watching. The footage recorded quietly, without reaction. Outside, the town remained asleep. Missy Bevers was on her way. She left home early, as planned, driving toward the church in the darkness before sunrise. Her arrival time placed her on a path that would intersect with the person already inside the building. The timeline was narrowing. Missy entered the church shortly after 4:30 in the morning. She came alone. She expected to find an empty building. She expected to prepare for her class. What happened next occurred inside the church, away from the cameras. There is no footage of the moment when Missy encountered the person moving through the halls. What is known is that Missy was attacked and killed inside the building. The injuries she sustained were severe and fatal. The violence was sudden. By the time the person left the church, Missy Bevers was dead. The suspect exited the building without being clearly captured on camera. No clear footage shows their departure. The building returned to stillness. Lights remained on. Doors stood as they had been left. A few minutes later, The routine of the morning resumed, though nothing about it would feel routine again. Participants began arriving for the fitness class. They expected music, movement, Missy's familiar voice. Instead, they found something wrong. Confusion spread quickly. Emergency services were called. Law enforcement arrived and secured the scene. What had been an ordinary early morning routine became a crime scene. Within hours, the town of Midlothian learned that Missy Bevers had been killed. The news spread quickly. Shock settled in. The investigation began immediately. And from the very beginning, one element stood out above all others. The footage, the silent video of a person walking through the church in the hours before Missy arrived. The image would be replayed countless times. It would be studied by investigators, analysts, and the public, and it would become one of the most recognizable pieces of unsolved case footage in modern true crime. But on that morning, none of that was known yet, only that a woman had left home to teach a class and had not come home again. When investigators first reviewed the security footage from the church, there was an immediate sense of unease, not because of what was happening, but because of how calmly it was happening. The cameras inside the building were positioned to monitor hallways, entrances, and shared spaces. They were not designed for drama. They existed to quietly record whatever passed in front of them. Most of the time, that meant nothing at all. On this morning, however, the footage captured a person moving through the church long before Missy Bevers arrived. The first appearance of the suspect showed them entering the building shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning. The timing mattered. It placed the person inside the church for an extended period, alone, before anyone else arrived. They were not rushing. Their movements were slow and deliberate. The clothing they wore immediately drew attention. The outfit resembled police tactical gear. A helmet, a vest, protective padding on the arms and legs. At first glance, it could be mistaken for law enforcement equipment, but upon closer inspection, it did not match standard police uniforms. The patches were unclear. The fit appeared unusual. The person carried tools, including what appeared to be a hammer or similar object. As the footage continued, the individual moved from hallway to hallway. They opened doors. They entered rooms. They paused. Sometimes they stood still for several seconds, as if listening or deciding where to go next. The building itself became an important part of the story. The church was large, with long corridors and multiple rooms branching off from central walkways. In the absence of people, the space felt expansive and hollow. Footsteps echoed. Movement felt amplified. The person's walk drew particular attention. It was not smooth or light. Some described it as heavy. Others noticed a slight side-to-side sway. The gait appeared unusual enough that it would later become one of the most analyzed aspects of the case. Investigators and members of the public would study it frame by frame, trying to determine what it might reveal. Was the person injured? Was the equipment weighing them down? Was the walk natural to them? At this stage, none of those questions had answers. All that existed was the footage. The person continued moving through the church. At times, they struck doors or walls with the tools they carried. The strikes were not forceful enough to break through. They appeared almost casual. Nothing was stolen. No attempt was made to access offices or storage areas in a way that suggested theft. This behavior stood out. It did not fit the pattern of a burglary. It did not resemble vandalism driven by anger or chaos. The actions felt controlled, contained. The person did not appear startled by their surroundings. They did not look over their shoulder frequently. They did not react as if worried about being discovered. They moved as though they expected to be alone. The footage captured them opening one door after another, peering inside, then moving on. Sometimes they lingered. Sometimes they walked away without entering. The building remained silent. No alarms sounded. No other people appeared. For more than 30 minutes, the person moved freely through the church. This period of time would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The idea that someone could occupy the space for so long, undetected, added to the sense of vulnerability surrounding the crime. When Missy Bevers arrived at the church, the cameras did not capture her entrance. She parked and entered in an area not covered by surveillance. From that moment onward, what happened inside the building was largely unseen. Investigators believe that Missy encountered the person inside the church. There is no footage of the interaction. There are no recordings of voices. What is known comes from the evidence left behind. Missy was attacked shortly after entering the building. The injuries she sustained were severe and fatal. The attack was direct. It did not appear to be random. After Missy was killed, the suspect left the building. Once again, there was no clear footage showing the person exiting. This absence raised additional questions. How did they leave? Which route did they take? Why was their departure not captured in the same way as their movements inside? The cameras returned to recording empty hallways. Stillness settled back over the building. When Missy's fitness class participants began to arrive, the footage showed ordinary movement returning. Cars pulled into the parking lot. Doors opened. People entered, expecting a familiar routine. Instead, they found something deeply wrong. Emergency services were called quickly. Law enforcement arrived and secured the scene. The church was closed off. What had been a place of community became a place of investigation. The footage was reviewed repeatedly. Investigators examined every second. They tracked the suspect's movements through the building, mapping out where they had been and when. The unusual clothing became a focal point. Why wear tactical gear? Was it meant as a disguise? Was it intended to intimidate? The tools carried by the suspect were examined closely. The nature of the injuries suggested that a blunt object had been used. This aligned with what appeared to be visible in the footage, but the exact sequence of events remained unclear. As the investigation progressed, the footage was released to the public. Investigators hoped someone would recognize something: the walk, the clothing, the posture. The response was immediate. The video circulated widely. News outlets aired it repeatedly. Online communities formed around analyzing every detail. People slowed the footage down. They zoomed in. They compared frames. The suspect's walk became one of the most discussed elements. Some believed it indicated a physical injury. Others suggested the gear itself caused the unusual movement. Some questioned whether the person was male or female. The ambiguity of the figure only added to the fascination. Despite the intense focus, no definitive identification emerged. The footage offered visibility, but not clarity. Years would pass with the image of the suspect etched into public consciousness. A person walking through an empty church in the early hours of the morning, unhurried, uninterrupted, unidentified. By the time Missy Bevers arrived at the church that morning, the building had already been occupied for some time. She entered expecting what she had always found: an empty space, quiet hallways, time to prepare for her class. The early morning routine was familiar to her. She had done this many times before. What she could not have known was that someone else was still inside the building. There is no camera footage showing the moment Missy entered. There is no audio recording of what followed. What investigators were able to determine came from physical evidence, timelines, and the aftermath. Missy encountered the person moving through the church shortly after her arrival. The interaction was brief. The attack was sudden. Missy was struck repeatedly with a blunt object. The injuries she sustained were severe and fatal. There was no prolonged struggle recorded. There was no indication that the attack was random. The violence ended quickly. When it was over, Missy Bevers was dead. The suspect left the building sometime after the attack. Once again, there was no clear footage showing the person exiting the church. The cameras did not capture their departure. How they left, and exactly when, remains unclear. What is known is that the building returned to stillness. Lights remained on. Doors remained as they had been left. For a brief period, nothing moved. Then the ordinary routine of the morning resumed. Participants began arriving for Missy's fitness class. Cars pulled into the parking lot. People entered the building, expecting music, energy, and Missy's familiar presence. Instead, they sensed something was wrong almost immediately. The atmosphere felt different. The building was too quiet. Missy was nowhere to be found. As people moved further inside, concern turned into alarm. Missy's body was discovered inside the church. Emergency services were called. Police and paramedics arrived quickly. The building was evacuated and secured. What had begun as a normal Monday morning became a crime scene. News spread rapidly through Midlothian. Within hours, residents learned that Missy Bevers, a well-known fitness instructor and mother, had been murdered inside a church. Shock settled heavily over the community. People struggled to reconcile the violence with the setting. A church, an early morning fitness class, a routine that had felt safe. Investigators began working immediately. The crime scene was processed carefully. Evidence was collected. The path of the suspect inside the building was mapped using the surveillance footage. Investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline minute by minute. One of the first questions was motive. Nothing had been taken from the church. Missy's belongings were left behind. There were no signs of robbery. The attack appeared targeted, but what that target was and why was not immediately clear. Attention returned again and again to the footage. The suspect's clothing suggested intention. Wearing tactical-style gear created the appearance of authority. It could have been meant to confuse. It could have been meant to intimidate. Or it could have been intended simply to conceal identity. Investigators also examined Missy's personal life. They looked at her relationships, her routines, her online presence, her work. Nothing immediately stood out as an obvious reason someone would want to harm her. She was described by friends and family as positive, supportive, and community-oriented. The lack of an apparent motive added to the mystery. As details of the crime emerged, public attention intensified. The footage became central not only to the investigation, but to public discussion. The image of a person wandering calmly through a church in police-style gear before committing murder was deeply unsettling. It challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity. People questioned how such a crime could occur without interruption, why no alarm had sounded, why no one noticed anything unusual. The investigation expanded beyond the church. Police reviewed traffic cameras. They examined nearby businesses. They searched for vehicles that might have been in the area at the time. They followed leads as they came in. Tips poured in from across the country. People believed they recognized the suspect's walk. They thought the clothing looked familiar. They suggested possible identities. Investigators worked to verify each lead. Most went nowhere. As days turned into weeks, frustration grew. Despite the volume of footage, the suspect remained unidentified. The disguise had done its job. The face was never visible. The gear concealed distinguishing features. The walk, though unusual, could not be definitively linked to a specific person. The lack of answers weighed heavily on Missy's family. They were forced to grieve publicly, while also living with constant uncertainty. Media attention followed them closely. Questions repeated. Speculation circulated, but clarity remained out of reach. For the community, the crime altered perceptions of safety. Early morning routines no longer felt neutral. Churches, gyms, and public spaces were viewed differently. People became more cautious, more aware. The sense that something terrible could happen quietly, without warning, lingered. As the investigation continued, law enforcement remained careful with information. They released details selectively. They emphasized that the case was active, that they were continuing to pursue leads, that they had not ruled anything out. Despite this, no arrest was made. Months passed. The footage remained. The image of the suspect walking through the church became frozen in time, a moment that repeated endlessly, without resolution. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Missy Bevers' murder settled into a difficult rhythm. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden discoveries that shifted the case forward. Instead, there was persistence. Investigators continued reviewing footage. They followed up on tips. They revisited timelines. The image of the suspect walking through the church remained at the center of everything. It was both the case's greatest asset and its greatest limitation. The video showed movement, but not identity. It offered visibility without certainty. When law enforcement released the footage publicly, they did so with purpose. They hoped someone would recognize something. A walk, a posture, a habit. They hoped the disguise would fail under familiarity. The public responded immediately. The video spread quickly across news outlets and online platforms. People watched it repeatedly. Some slowed it down frame by frame. Others watched it in real time, over and over again. Attention focused intensely on the suspect's gait. Some believed the person walked with a limp. Others thought the movement came from heavy boots or restrictive gear. Debate followed. Was the suspect male or female? Tall or short? Athletic or average? The footage allowed for interpretation, but not confirmation. Online communities formed around analyzing the case. People shared theories. Some were thoughtful, others were reckless. Names were suggested. In some cases, innocent individuals found themselves pulled into speculation they had no connection to. Law enforcement repeatedly urged caution. They reminded the public that speculation could harm real people. They stressed that theories were not evidence. Despite the noise, investigators continued working quietly. They examined Missy's life closely. They reviewed her schedule, her relationships, her communications. They searched for anything that might explain why she had been targeted. No clear motive emerged. There was no indication that Missy had been threatened. No evidence of conflict that would suggest someone wanted her dead. The absence of motive made the case harder to solve. Crimes driven by clear personal conflict often leave traces. This one did not. As time passed, the case grew colder, but it never disappeared. Each anniversary brought renewed attention. New stories resurfaced. The footage was replayed again. The same questions were asked. The same uncertainty remained. For Missy's family, time moved differently. Grief did not fade with public attention. It lived quietly alongside everyday life. They continued without answers, without knowing who had killed her, without understanding why. They carried the weight of both loss and uncertainty. The community of Midlothian carried it too. People remembered Missy not just as a victim, but as a presence, as a teacher, as a motivator, as someone who brought energy into early mornings. Fitness classes continued elsewhere. Routines adjusted, but the memory of what had happened inside the church lingered. The building itself became symbolic, a place once associated with safety and routine, now carried an invisible history. Over time, the case became one of the most recognizable unsolved murders, tied to surveillance footage. The image of the suspect walking calmly through an empty church entered the wider true crime consciousness. It was unsettling, not because of what it showed, but because of what it did not. It did not show panic. It did not show urgency. It showed someone moving comfortably through a space where violence would soon occur. That quietness stayed with people. Years later, the case remains unsolved. No arrest has been made. The footage still exists. Investigators continue to receive tips. The case remains open. Technology advances. New methods of analysis emerge. There is still hope that something, a detail overlooked, a recognition delayed, a piece of information held quietly for years, may one day bring answers. Until then, time continues to move forward. Mornings still begin before dawn. Buildings still stand empty before the day fills them. People still arrive early, expecting routine. Most mornings pass without incident, and that is what makes the story of Missy Bevers linger, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it happened quietly, inside a space meant for community, during a time of day meant for preparation. If you are listening now, there is nothing you need to solve. The uncertainty belongs to the case, not to you. You can let the questions rest here. The story has unfolded as far as it can for now. The rest is waiting. You can allow your attention to soften. Breath moves in and out. Thoughts settle. The day or the night continues beyond this moment. Rest can arrive when it's ready. Good night.